run most of the cities that are in bad shape. We have many cities in great shape too, by the way. I want you to know that. But it seems that the ones that are run by the radical left Democrats, what they've done to San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, they're very unsafe places. And we're going to straighten them out one by one. And this is going to be a major part for some of the people in this room. That's a war too. It's a war from within. Controlling the physical territory of our border is essential to national security. But I want to salute every service member who has helped us carry out this critical mission. It's really a very important mission. And I told Pete we should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military. Because we're going into Chicago very soon. That's a big city with an incompetent governor, stupid.
Using American cities as training grounds for the United States military. That was part of President Trump's partisan address yesterday to hundreds of America's top military leaders at a Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia. Joining us now, MSNBC contributor Mike Barnicle.
Hi, friends. John back again. An undeclared war raged inside the White House, not between parties, but between Trump and his top military commanders over whether the Constitution still mattered. The most powerful military leaders privately asked how to stop the president from doing things they viewed as dangerous, illegal, and possibly catastrophic. Think about the sheer magnitude of what we're describing here. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer in the entire United States, the man who oversees all military operations from the Pentagon to the most remote outposts in hostile territory, had to actively work to contain orders coming from the Oval Office. The commanders of every military branch, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Space Force, and Coast Guard, all of them were united in their concern about the man at the top of the chain of command.
Retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Mark Hergling. Good morning to you both. General, I'll start with you and just your reaction. I'm sure you've talked to some of your old colleagues, maybe who are in the room or some who just watched at home. What was the reaction to that spectacle yesterday?
Yeah, Willie, I did talk to a few, many people in that room I've served with. I didn't retire that long ago, so some of those senior members were junior members when I was still in the service. What was interesting is it came about in two parts. First of all, Secretary Hegseth's address. I took notes as he spoke, as I was watching it. And just some of the things that I made bullet points about were Liberation Day, kill things and break people, or kill people and break things, war crimes, Geneva Convention elimination, rules of engagements are unnecessary, suggesting women can't meet the standards, returning to the days of drill sergeants smoking recruits during basic training, suggesting the elimination of IG actions, especially as he's being investigated for the use of signal apps by those IGs, hawking his own book at the end, The War on Warriors.
The National Security Advisor, the people responsible for coordinating the entire national security apparatus, they all shared the same alarm. When the people who have spent their entire professional lives defending the country, who have taken oaths to protect and defend the Constitution, who understand better than anyone the difference between legal orders and unconstitutional directives. When all of them are looking at each other with barely concealed horror, you have to ask yourself, what exactly was happening in those Oval Office meetings? General Mark Milley was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the absolute pinnacle of the American military hierarchy. This wasn't some mid-level officer with limited perspective. This was the man who reported directly to the president, who advised him on every major military decision.
I've read, and it's a compilation of thoughts from a disgruntled soldier who has very little understanding of strategic implications of various actions. Then when it turned to the president, you've already addressed this, meandering. Just all sorts of issues, much like the UN speech he gave. So many things to talk about from that speech, but the war from within, as you just mentioned, and putting soldiers on American streets to train how to react to different enemies from within were two of the highlights that I wrote down. And it was just a combination of two things that I believe we're leading to what we might see next. And the other thing I'd say is President Trump thrives on applause and cheering and interactions with an audience. And when he didn't get that and instead got quiet professionalism from the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in the audience, that likely rattled them from the very beginning. And that silence wasn't disrespect.
Who coordinated the global operations of the most powerful fighting force in human history. Milley had spent decades in uniform, had commanded troops in combat, had risen through the ranks through competence and dedication. He was exactly the kind of steady, experienced professional that the military system is designed to produce. And according to multiple accounts from journalists who had access to senior officials, Milley was genuinely alarmed by what he was witnessing in the Oval Office. Trump would push for extreme shows of force that Milley knew were illegal. He wanted active duty troops deployed on American streets against American citizens. He wanted military actions that violated the Posse Comitatus Act.
It was restraint and discipline and adherence to the oath of office. Yesterday was, to me, a collective reminder of our professional culture that we have in the military that transcends politics. It was on full display, and it was interesting to watch from both sides of the audience.
It was the oath to the Constitution, not to the man standing in front of them. So can you speak, General, just for people watching this morning who have so much coming at them 24 hours a day, why this you view as so unusual and so dangerous to be talking about using American cities as, quote, training grounds for the American military and having the United States military go in and effectively do domestic policing of gangs and whatever else Donald Trump wants them to do?
Well, primarily, Willie, is because it's illegal and it violates our oath of office to defend the Constitution, which says the military is not to be used. Specifically, that was put in the Constitution against securing American streets other than when there is an insurrection within the Republic, which...
A law that has stood for nearly a century and a half as a bulwark against using the military for domestic law enforcement. He wanted to treat the armed forces as his personal political instrument rather than as a constitutional institution bound by law. Milley had to figure out how to handle this situation, and it was an impossible position for any military officer to be in. If he publicly refused orders, it would create a constitutional crisis that could shatter the military's apolitical tradition and potentially lead to a coup. If he just quietly complied, he would be violating his oath to the Constitution and allowing illegal actions to proceed. So Milley and his team found a middle ground. They documented everything. Every conversation, every request.
President Lincoln saw. But the indications are people are asking us to prepare to do that. So that means there's measures afoot to try and make that happen. Because I don't see it, and you can bet that all the 400 or 800 people in that audience, the generals and the senior enlisted advisors, don't see it either. And many of them have seen conflict. They have been involved in war. They know what it's like, and they also know you don't take up arms against innocent civilians, especially ones in the United States who are executing their First Amendment rights of free speech and protesting against the government.
General, I don't know whether you've seen the front page of the Wall Street Journal today. I'm now holding it up on camera. There's a photo shot of the front rows of many of the former members, your former friends in the military, sitting there watching and listening to the spectacle yesterday. And I too spoke to several of your colleagues, former colleagues, yesterday. And the word I kept hearing from them was embarrassment. Because if you look at that picture,
every directive was recorded in careful detail. They had back-channel discussions about how to contain Trump's worst impulses without publicly breaking with the chain of command. They worked quietly to ensure that when Trump ordered something extreme, it got filtered through layers of military bureaucracy until it emerged in a form that was legal and constitutional. And when they couldn't prevent things from happening, they made sure that journalists knew what was going on behind closed doors. Leaks started flowing out of the Pentagon and the White House, painting a picture of a president who didn't understand or care about constitutional constraints. This wasn't just speculation or rumor. Books were written by senior officials. Journalists with impeccable credentials had access to sitting military leaders who described Oval Office scenes that were genuinely alarming. These weren't anonymous sources making wild accusations from the shadows. These were people with direct access to Trump. People who sat in those meetings and witnessed the conversations firsthand. People who had the security clearances and the professional expertise to understand exactly what they were seeing. They talked about Trump wanting to use the military against American protesters. They described his casual attitude toward classified information, how he would share sensitive intelligence with people who had no security clearance simply to impress them. They revealed Trump's attempts to use military and national security tools for personal and political advantage. The military was essentially telling the American people through these leaks and interviews that they had to actively work to prevent the president from doing illegal and dangerous things. That's a stunning admission, and it should have been front-page news every single day. What makes this all the more remarkable is that the military leadership knew they couldn't speak publicly while Trump was still in office. The chain of command requires obedience, at least in appearance. The military's apolitical tradition demands silence about partisan matters. They had to maintain the appearance of loyalty even as they were working behind the scenes to constrain the president's worst impulses. So they documented, they contained, they leaked quietly, and they waited. They knew that eventually Trump would leave office, either through electoral defeat or the natural end of his term. And when that happened, the floodgates would open. They could finally tell the full story of what had happened in those rooms, what they had witnessed, what they had to do to protect the Constitution from the commander-in-chief himself. One story that really illustrates how chaotic and dangerous things were involves a group chat about war plans and military strikes. Someone in Trump's national security team accidentally included a journalist in this conversation. A journalist. We're talking about sensitive war planning information, classified discussions about potential military operations, all being shared through a chat that included a member of the press. Think about what that tells you about the level of professionalism in the Oval Office operation. You've got the highest levels of the national security apparatus. People who should be meticulous about operational security, who should be guarding classified information with their lives, and they can't even keep track of who's on a group chat. They're casually discussing classified military operations with a journalist in the room. That's how loose and sloppy everything was. That's how little concern there was for proper procedures and legal boundaries. The military leaders were watching this unfold, and they were horrified because they realized they were dealing with an administration that didn't understand or didn't care about basic security protocols. People were going to get killed because of this carelessness. Sources and methods were going to be compromised. Lives were going to be endangered. Then you've got the classified information issue, which is actually a separate scandal but ties directly into this larger pattern of presidential misconduct. Trump has a documented history of disclosing highly classified information to foreign officials in ways that compromised intelligence sources and methods. He's been cavalier about national security secrets throughout his time in office. He shares sensitive intelligence with people who had no business knowing it. He treats classified information like it's his personal property that he can show off to impress people, to demonstrate his access, to prove that he's in the know. He would tell world leaders things they had no business knowing. Details about intelligence operations, sources, collection methods, all of it shared casually in conversations that shouldn't have included any of that information. He would reference sensitive intelligence in ways that exposed how the United States gathered that intelligence, potentially burning sources who had risked their lives to provide it. The military and intelligence community watched this happen repeatedly, and they felt completely helpless. They couldn't stop him from doing it. The president has broad authority over classified information, and there's no effective mechanism to prevent a president from sharing it inappropriately. They could only document it, create a record of what happened, and hope that eventually there would be accountability. And the frustration built up over time as they watched classified information getting shared inappropriately again and again. Sources were endangered, methods were exposed, the trust of allied intelligence services was eroded, and Trump didn't seem to care at all. He viewed it all as his personal property, something he could use however he wanted, regardless of the consequences for national security. So you have this incredible dynamic where Trump is the president, he has all the formal power of the office, but his own military leadership is actively working against him behind the scenes because they view him as a threat to the Constitution and to national security. They're leaking to the press. They're writing in their memoirs about what he said and did. They're giving interviews to journalists describing Oval Office conversations that would shock the American people. They're essentially creating a historical record of the alarming things they witnessed, a record that will be studied for generations to come. In some ways, it's like a delayed strike back. They couldn't stop him while he was president. They couldn't refuse orders and maintain their positions, but they could and did expose his conduct after the fact. They could tell the story of what actually happened in those rooms. They could let the American people know that their own military leadership viewed the president as dangerous and potentially unfit for office. Let me take you inside some of these Oval Office moments that the generals and national security officials described to journalists and in books. Picture this scene. Trump is in the Oval Office and there are protests breaking out in American cities. This is 2020. There's civil unrest, demonstrations, clashes between protesters and law enforcement. And Trump is absolutely furious about what he's seeing on television. He wants a show of force. He wants to project strength. He wants the world to see that the American government is in control. He's talking about using active duty military troops to quell protests on American streets. He wants tanks rolling through American cities. He wants soldiers in riot gear confronting American citizens. He wants a display of military power that would intimidate the protesters and show that the government can't be challenged. He's imagining military vehicles moving through the streets, troops with weapons facing down American citizens, all of it broadcast on television for the world to see. And Milley is sitting there listening to this, and Milley understands immediately that what Trump is describing is illegal. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 prevents the military from being used for domestic law enforcement without specific congressional authorization. This is a foundational principle of American democracy. We don't use the military to police Americans. We have police forces for that. We have the National Guard, which operates under different legal authorities. We have law enforcement agencies at every level of government. But the active duty military is supposed to be used for foreign threats, for defending the country against external enemies, not for controlling American citizens exercising their constitutional rights. That's exactly what the founders were afraid of when they designed the constitutional system. They understood that a standing army could be used to suppress dissent and maintain political control. And they built safeguards to prevent that from happening. Trump doesn't care about the Posse Comitatus Act. He doesn't care about constitutional constraints. He wants results. He wants strength. He wants to look powerful. He wants to demonstrate that he's in control no matter what the law says. And Milley has to figure out how to respond to that. He can't just say no to the president. That would be insubordination, a direct violation of the chain of command. But he also can't allow illegal military deployments to happen on his watch. He has an oath to the Constitution that requires him to refuse unlawful orders. So he does what a lot of military officials did in this situation. He documents the request. He makes sure there's a record of what Trump asked for. He discusses it with other senior officials, ensuring that everyone understands the legal and constitutional implications. And he works quietly to make sure that certain things don't happen. Trump might order something, but by the time it gets filtered through the military chain of command, it gets implemented in a way that's legal and constitutional, or it doesn't get implemented at all. It's basically a workaround. It's the military saying yes to the president while actually doing something different than what he asked for. It's a dangerous game because it undermines the chain of command. And if it ever became public while Trump was still president, it would be a massive scandal. But from the military's perspective, it's the only way to maintain constitutional order. And this happened repeatedly. Trump would push for extreme actions, and the military would find ways to constrain those actions while still appearing to comply with the president's general intent. It was like a constant dance, Trump pushing for chaos and power displays, the military leadership trying to keep things within legal and constitutional bounds. And the military knew that this couldn't go on forever. They knew that eventually Trump would leave office. They knew that at that point they could tell the full story of what happened behind the scenes. They knew that when Trump was no longer president, they would be free to speak publicly about what they had witnessed and what they had to do to contain his worst impulses. So when Trump left office, the floodgates opened. Milley started giving interviews. Other senior officials started writing books. Journalists got access to people who had been in those Oval Office meetings, and they all started describing what they had witnessed. They described Trump's impulses toward authoritarianism, his desire to use military power against American citizens, his willingness to ignore legal and constitutional constraints. They described his casual disregard for the Constitution, how he treated the document as an inconvenience rather than the supreme law of the land. They described his willingness to use military and national security tools for personal and political advantage, to reward his allies and punish his enemies using the power of the state. The picture that emerged was of a president who didn't understand the constraints of his office and didn't particularly care about them. A president who viewed the military as his personal instrument rather than as an institution bound by law and the Constitution. A president who wanted absolute loyalty and didn't understand why military officers had to answer to the law rather than just to him. A president who fundamentally didn't grasp what it means to serve the Constitution rather than a person. One of the most detailed accounts came from The New Yorker, where journalists had access to Milley and other senior officials. They got detailed descriptions of Oval Office conversations that would shock any American who takes the Constitution seriously. Milley described moments where he felt like he was the only thing standing between Trump and actions that could destabilize the entire country or violate the Constitution in fundamental ways. He talked about being in conversations where Trump suggested things that made his jaw drop, things that demonstrated a profound lack of understanding about basic constitutional principles. He talked about having to educate Trump on what the military is allowed to do, on what the law requires, on the difference between a constitutional order and a dictatorship. He talked about Trump's fundamental lack of understanding about what the military is for and how it operates, how he viewed the armed forces as a political tool rather than a constitutional institution. He talked about Trump wanting military action that Milley knew violated the law, that would have been illegal and unconstitutional, and having to find ways to prevent that from happening while still maintaining the appearance of loyalty to the chain of command. And then you've got the group chat incident, which illustrates the security failures in the Oval Office. Someone in the national security team accidentally included a journalist in a discussion about military operations and war planning. A journalist, someone from the press, someone who shouldn't have had access to any of that information, was inadvertently included in a group chat about classified military planning. That tells you everything you need to know about the level of security and professionalism in the Oval Office. The military leadership saw this and they realized they were dealing with people who didn't understand basic operational security, people who were sloppy with sensitive information, people who posed a genuine national security risk. This wasn't incompetence that could be excused or explained away. This was carelessness that endangered lives and endangered national security. Sources could be burned, operations could be compromised, people could die because of this kind of sloppiness. So the military and intelligence community faced a real dilemma. How do you handle a president who you view as a national security threat? You can't just refuse to follow orders. That would be a military coup. And the military has no authority to remove a president, no matter how dangerous he might be. You can't launch a coup. That would be the end of American democracy as we know it. You can't publicly attack the president while he's still in office, because that would undermine the chain of command and create a constitutional crisis. But you can document everything. You can work quietly to contain the most dangerous impulses. You can make sure that when the president leaves office, there's a record of what happened. And that's what they did. They documented, they contained, they waited. And when Trump left office, they started talking. They started giving interviews. They started writing books. They started exposing what had happened in those Oval Office meetings. The larger question this raises is what happens when the president and the military are in fundamental conflict about how the military should be used and what the Constitution requires. In this case, the military won that battle. They managed to contain Trump's impulses. They prevented some of the worst abuses from happening. But what if next time the military leadership isn't as principled? What if next time there's a president who has more yes men in key military positions? People who will follow orders regardless of legality. What if next time the military doesn't push back effectively because the leadership is more loyal to the president than to the Constitution? That's a scary scenario, and it's one that we should all be thinking about. That's why these stories and these accounts matter so much. They show us how fragile our constitutional order can be, how much depends on the character and principles of the people in key positions. They show us that the military is not an automatic check on presidential power. The military only acts as a check if the leadership has the courage and the principle to do so. If the leadership is compromised, if they value loyalty to the president over loyalty to the Constitution, then the checks fail and the president can do whatever he wants. And that's exactly why all these accounts and leaks and books have been so important. They've essentially created a public record of how alarmed the military leadership was about Trump's conduct. They've documented the moments where the military had to push back against unconstitutional orders, the times when the chain of command was used to filter and constrain presidential directives, the classified information mishandling that endangered national security. They've created a historical record that will be studied for generations, a record that future presidents will have to reckon with. When people talk about the military striking back against Trump by exposing Oval Office crimes, they're talking about this dynamic. They're talking about the military using the only tool available to them after Trump left office, which is going public with their accounts and their concerns. They're talking about creating public pressure and public awareness of what actually happened in those Oval Office meetings. They're talking about holding Trump accountable through the court of public opinion when the formal institutions might not be able to do so. That's the strike back. That's the military using whatever power they have to expose and document presidential overreach. They couldn't stop it while it was happening, but they could make sure that the American people knew about it afterwards. They could make sure that there was accountability, even if it was just the accountability of public exposure. And that's a powerful thing. It's a reminder that even when formal institutions fail, there are still people with courage and principle who will do the right thing. There are still people who will put their oath to the Constitution above their loyalty to any individual. There are still people who believe in the rule of law and who will fight to protect it even when it's difficult and dangerous. The military leadership faced an impossible situation and they handled it as well as could be expected. They didn't stage a coup. They didn't publicly break with the commander-in-chief. But they also didn't just follow illegal orders. They found a way to thread the needle, to protect the Constitution while maintaining the appearance of military loyalty. And when the time came, they told the truth about what happened. Military leaders defended the Constitution against Trump's dangerous impulses, not through a coup, but through principled resistance. The story shows both that institutions can work when people of courage stand up, and how fragile our constitutional order really is.